The United States Army, in 1943, was fighting a war against a racial ideology overseas while running segregated bases at home, and almost nobody in a position of power seemed to find that strange. At Fort Riley, Kansas, black soldiers with the qualifications to become officers were being quietly blocked from officer candidate school, with no explanation given. One of those men would later break baseball's color barrier. The man who picked up the phone on their behalf was a private first class who happened to be the most famous athlete alive. What history books won't tell you is that Joe Louis's most consequential act during the Second World War had nothing to do with boxing. Everyone remembers that he enlisted. Everyone remembers the exhibitions, the war bond drives, the recruiting posters. What almost nobody talks about is what he did quietly, from inside the ranks, with no authority and no protection, for a group of men whose careers the Army had already decided to end before they began. And one of those men's names you already know. But to understand what Joe Louis risked, you need to understand what the Army actually was in 1943. The United States Armed Forces were formally segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, usually under white officers, and were disproportionately assigned to labor and support roles rather than combat commands. Base facilities were divided. Recreation halls, post exchanges, transportation, seating at entertainment events, all of it operated under the same racial lines that governed civilian life in much of the country. The government that was asking black Americans to fight fascism abroad was, at the same time, running an institution that in practice looked a great deal like the thing it claimed to be fighting. Joe Louis had enlisted voluntarily in January 1942, weeks after Pearl Harbor. He didn't wait for a draft notice. He was the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, arguably the most recognizable black man in America, and he could have arranged almost any kind of comfortable arrangement he wanted. Instead, he joined as a private, was assigned to a cavalry unit, and was sent to Fort Riley, Kansas. The Army knew exactly what it had. Joe Louis was worth more as a symbol than as a soldier, and it used him accordingly. He was sent on morale tours, fought dozens of exhibition bouts for troops across multiple theaters, appeared in recruiting materials, and helped raise enormous sums through war relief efforts. Money that, as we've covered before on this channel, he was later taxed on, as though he'd kept it. The image the government wanted was simple and effective. The man who beat Hitler's champion in an American uniform, doing his part. What the Army did not want was for that same man to start asking questions about how it treated the soldiers around him. At Fort Riley in 1942 and 1943, there was a group of black soldiers who had met the qualifications for officer candidate school, the program that turned enlisted men into commissioned officers. On paper, the Army had opened OCS to black candidates. In practice, at Fort Riley, their applications went nowhere. Weeks passed, then months. No formal rejection came, because a formal rejection would have required a stated reason. The applications simply sat, unprocessed, in a bureaucratic limbo that everyone involved understood perfectly well, and nobody would say out loud. One of the men caught in that limbo was a young lieutenant-to-be named Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Jackie Robinson had been an extraordinary athlete at UCLA, a four-sport standout, articulate, educated, and by any objective standard, exactly the kind of candidate an officer program should have wanted. He was also stubborn in a way that made him dangerous to a system built on people quietly accepting what they were given. Robinson was not quietly accepting anything, then or later. Joe Louis was stationed on the same post. And here's where the story turns on something most people never think about when they picture a celebrity in uniform. Louis had no rank. He had no command authority. He could not order anyone to do anything. What he had was something the Army's chain of command hadn't accounted for: access. Joe Louis knew people in Washington. Specifically, he had a relationship with a lawyer named Truman Gibson, a black attorney who served as a civilian aide to the Secretary of War, one of the very few black men with any real proximity to power inside the War Department during that period. Louis got involved. According to accounts from Robinson himself, from Gibson, and from historians who have documented this period, Joe Louis raised the situation at Fort Riley directly with Gibson, pressing the case that qualified black soldiers were being frozen out of officer candidate school with no legitimate justification. Gibson took the matter up through the channels available to him inside the War Department. Within a relatively short period after that intervention, the logjam broke. The black candidates at Fort Riley, Jackie Robinson among them, were admitted to officer candidate school. Think about the actual mechanics of that decision from Lewis's side. He was a private. He was, at that exact moment, being used by the same Army as its most valuable public relations asset. Every incentive in his position pointed toward keeping his head down, doing his exhibitions, smiling for the cameras, and staying entirely out of internal Army politics. Complaining about segregation from inside the ranks, as the government's own showcase black soldier, was precisely the thing the War Department would not have wanted him doing. He did it anyway, quietly, through the one channel he had, and he did it for men he had no personal obligation to. And it didn't stop at the OCS issue. There are documented accounts of Lewis intervening in other incidents at Fort Riley, involving the treatment of black soldiers, including confronting the segregated seating arrangements at base facilities, and using his access to complain about conditions that enlisted men had no safe way to protest themselves. He was, in effect, functioning as an unofficial advocate for soldiers who had no advocate, using celebrity as leverage in an institution where celebrity was the only currency he possessed. Robinson's own Army story didn't end at Fort Riley. In July 1944, after being commissioned as a second lieutenant and transferred to Camp Hood in Texas, Robinson refused a civilian bus driver's order to move to the back of a military bus, an order that violated the Army's own recently issued regulations prohibiting racial segregation on military transportation. Robinson was arrested and court-martialed. He was ultimately acquitted of all charges, and he received an honorable discharge later that year, but the experience left a mark. Robinson would sign with the Brooklyn Dodgers organization the following year and break Major League Baseball's color barrier in 1947. Here's what nobody saw coming, in the way that history sometimes arranges itself without anyone planning it. The man who broke baseball's color line in 1947, whose composure under years of sustained abuse became one of the defining moral images of 20th century American sport, got his officer's commission in part because a private first class with no authority made a phone call on his behalf in 1943. Robinson himself acknowledged Lewis's role in later accounts. It was not a small favor. Being a commissioned officer changed Robinson's trajectory, his standing, and his sense of what he was entitled to demand from institutions that were designed to give him nothing. And Joe Lewis got almost nothing out of it. There was no press release. The Army did not publicize it, for obvious reasons. It didn't appear on a recruiting poster. Lewis went back to his exhibitions, back to the morale tours, back to raising money for a government that would spend the following 2 decades pursuing him for taxes on income he had donated. The men he helped went on to their commissions, and one of them went on to change American sports permanently, and the story of how that happened stayed almost entirely inside the ranks where it occurred. That's the part of Joe Lewis that doesn't fit the poster, not the fighter who carried a nation's hopes into a ring at Yankee Stadium in 1938. A private in a segregated army with no rank and no protection, who understood that the only real power he had was the ability to get a phone call answered in Washington, and who chose to spend that power on a handful of soldiers nobody else was going to help. He never talked about it much afterward. He wasn't built that way. When people asked Joe Lewis about his war service, he talked about the exhibitions and the troops and the money raised, the safe answers, the ones that fit the image everyone already had of him. The rest of it, the part where he quietly went around a chain of command to get men promoted who were being frozen out for being black, mostly reached the public through other people's accounts, years later, told by the men who benefited from it. If something in this story caught you off guard the way it caught me, if you thought you knew what Joe Lewis did during the war and realized the most important thing he did never made it onto a single poster, do me a favor and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps a small channel trying to dig up the parts of history that got buried on purpose. Subscribe if you want more of this, because we are just getting started, and there are more moments like this one, more quiet decisions nobody photographed, waiting to be told. This is what real character looks like when nobody's watching. See you in the next one.